Hi, welcome to another one of my Alteryx tutorials. What we're going to look at today is how to bring some transactional data into an existing data mart. Basically, you'll be building a little ETL workflow so that you can keep your reporting up to date. Unlike many of my tutorials that I've done for a previous company before retiring, this one will bring in a large number of Alteryx widgets in order to solve the problem, as opposed to just simply showing you one or two new widgets and how they would work. Also going to introduce you to my buddy John Q, who is driving this data acquisition and reporting. And in this problem statement for John, he daily receives a transaction file from the operational system that Daisy Hill maintains to register puppies for training. Each of these transactions includes some minor information about the puppy that will be useful as they are being trained and reported. So to bring this data in, we're going to utilize a number of Alteryx widgets in this workflow. As you can see, once you begin to build an Alteryx workflow, the number of widgets that you bring in tend to make it more complicated, but they're necessary because in your Alteryx workflow, what you are doing is stepwise manipulating your data, taking it from its origin into its final destination as it flows through all of the widgets, each widget having a specific job that it needs to do to transform or convert or to prepare that data as you're going forward. We also want to talk very briefly about where we're going with this data, and I'll bring you up my data model. So essentially this is the little data mart that I've created for John Q. It has in it information about the breeds, basically the breed name, information about the kennel name and the state code, and then we maintain our puppy data or dimension, which has the puppy's name and their birth date, and then a little fact table at this point in time that just has in it a birth weight. As we go through these exercises, the facts that we track about a puppy will be expanded with different methods for updating them. In this case, simply when we receive a new puppy record, we want to create the dimension record and create the fact record. What does this data look like coming in? It's your typical flat file that's given to us by the development team. It has each of the attributes separated by what's considered in technical jargon as a bang. So each field is separated by the bang. We need to bring that data in and then process it into our tables. For this tutorial, what I will be doing is bringing in pieces of already configured widgets, showing you what they are doing as opposed to building everything from scratch. So in this case, this is the data that we're dealing with. We have our puppy data. We have the breed data, the kennel data, and at the very bottom, we have a text data that will be utilized in order to prepare a transaction log record at the completion of the processing into our dimensions. As you should be familiar by now, once you bring a single widget in and configure it into your workflow, it is fully executable. So we can run this workflow just to take a look at how the data comes through. And you can see that when we bring the data in from our text file, we need to set the data types and sizes accordingly. We have our breed data, our kennel data, and it's good to note within these dimensions we have two additional records other than just the actual kennels themselves. One is the 0 ID that has to do with if the value coming in is null, and a -1 ID if the value coming in is unknown. We don't just want to populate our kennel and breed dimensions with any data, because this tends to pollute it and make it unusable. Instead, we want to deal with it in a controlled manner. So to process this data, we first are going to deal with our puppy dimension. This data is a bit straightforward to process. Simply, each record that comes in, we want to select off just the fields that we need and rename the puppy ID to our warehouse ID. Deselect the breed name and kennel name and the birth weight, because these are not part of the dimension table. We then want to go ahead and, to this record, append the current date and time. And we can do this by bringing in one additional widget, moving these down because we don't need them quite yet. We'll be using this widget, the data from this widget, in each of our separate workflows. Simply put, what we want to do is to get the current date for this run. We want to choose down towards the bottom the year, month, day format. That is the Alteryx default for a timestamp. It comes in as a text field and has a name that you cannot change. So we want to go ahead and give it a better name and turn it into a date time. And we rename this to batch timestamp. We want to use the Append Fields to get this piece of data into our data flow. Caution must be used if you're not familiar with the Append Fields widget. What it does a product join, whereby it takes every record from our target stream and joins it to every record in our source stream. What this means is that if we have 200 records from our target stream and we have 2 records in our source stream, we end up with 400 records coming out the other side. Recommended that you not use a large set of data in this join. From the source standpoint, just simply for performance purposes. In this case, there's only 1 record here. We will not be increasing the size of the stream, just simply getting more data onto it. Running this the first time, we'll put a browse on here very quickly. And we can see that we have our simple 200 records going into our dimension. And after the append, we now have a timestamp on this as well. Before putting data into a database, I always like to use a browse to go ahead and verify that it looks good. And we'll go ahead and create our connection to our database through the output widget. I have one predefined that we're going to be using. Note that we do not want to change the data that's currently in this table. We want to simply append existing records onto it. And I'll always choose the style to be none to make sure I have good names going forward. Now when I run this, you can see that we are connecting to the database and inserting these 200 records into it. Inserting records into my web services is just a little slow, so that's one reason why I only chose a few records to insert. And you can see when I click on the output widget, the data has been inserted in. So we're ready to go on and process our fact table. One problem we have during development now is that we don't want to reinsert these records into the dimension, we just want to continue to work now through the fact table. There is a widget that can help us with this. I have it here, the tool container, as part of my favorites because I use it quite often. If you haven't yet used it, it's over here under documentation. This tool does a little bit more than documentation. We're going to give it a name, which is puppy dimension. That's great for documentation purposes. We want to choose just those widgets that are part of this process. We'll highlight those, and now we drag them into our container. Once our mouse is over top of the container, you see that it turns light blue as opposed to the normal black. Let go, and it puts it in there. So now I have documented this process that these 3 widgets are used in populating the puppy dimension. What a lot of people don't realize is not outside of documentation, I also have the ability to disable this set of widgets or this part of my stream. Clicking on the disable means that it will not be executed. We can verify that by running it again, and you see that it very quickly goes through and pulls in the other pieces of data, but does not do any of the work for the puppy dimension. So we are now free to go ahead and begin to build part of the workflow to deal with the fact table. So let's bring a couple of widgets in, and we'll talk about how they're configured as we connect them up. So as we begin this stream, first thing we want to do is make sure we connect the stream into our select widget, because here we no longer need the puppy name or the birth date. We need the other data to be processed. If you look at this data, when we ran it through here originally, you can see that within the puppy name and the breed name, we have some null values floating in here. We want to take care of those null values and set them to none so that they will be matched up into our dimension properly. So if we start with the breed dimension first, but again, we want to change 2 values. You can do this in an individual formula where that formula works on each of the individual fields, but once you get to that second field, you're just repeating the code. And if you have a 3rd or 4th field, it becomes a bit redundant. In preparation, we have the multi-field formula. This allows us to create a formula that applies to multiple fields at once. By selecting text fields, I can choose breed name and kennel name, deselect copying it to another field, so it'll update the current field, and then down here in the expressions I need to create my formula. I always recommend that you use a standard formula widget first just to test out how you're doing it, because it is much easier to develop a formula with the proper syntax in the formula widget as into the multi-field formula. Because here you simply have a number of drop downs that will help you drag and drop, and you don't have autofill and other features in the normal formula widget. That being said, I use my conditional expression so that if the current field, which would be both of these individually, is null, then I send its value to none. Otherwise, I leave it the existing value. When you run this, what you will get out of it is it being populated with none for each of those. Once I've done that, I'm now confident to join this into my breed table. I use the union at the end of this because I will run into some records that still do not match because they are unknowns. So running this through very quickly, you can see that my nulls have been replaced with none. And I'm still left with a few that do not match up. Labradoodle was a new breed that was not yet managed by the breed dimension, and so I want to refer this back to the business owner to make sure that they're willing to bring that up. But But again, unioning them both together gives me a full set of records back again. And so now, by selecting and no longer needing the breed name, I can now have the breed warehouse ID. And you can see that each individual warehouse ID has been populated with a value. To see what that looks like, I'll drop my browse widget onto the end of it, run this. Going into breed wid, you see that while we still have some unknowns, we also have zeros as the min value and 10 as the max value with a couple of nulls left over. Those are the unknowns we'll have to handle later. We want to repeat this process for the kennel dimension. And again, I will just simply copy in some completed widgets and walk you through how they've been configured. It's the same three-step process. Hooking up the left and the right, putting a union in there to deal with the unknowns, selecting off the columns that I need because I no longer need kennel name, nor do I need state code, but now I can simply have my kennel wid in here as well. I'll drop the browse on the end, run this workflow, and you can see that my breed wid and kennel wid have been populated. Zero value meaning the none, but I still have those nulls left over that I need to set to -1 to match the unknown category. And as you might have guessed, we'll go ahead and use another multi-field formula to go ahead and replace those null values with a -1. So in this case, I want to use numeric fields, both the breed wid and the kennel wid, not copying them to a new field and creating the expression that if the current field is null, set it to -1. Running this one last time, you can see that we now no longer have nulls in our breed wid or kennel wid, but we do have -1 values for each of them. Finally, before putting this into the database, I'm going to make this screen a little bit smaller because I need to get that date and timestamp into here, going through the Append Fields and dragging in my current date and time. Can now look at the output from this and see that I have a good record to go into the database. All I need now is an output widget. Pasting in what already works, connecting it. We see that we're going to go into the puppy fact table, appending the data as we've done before. So now we run this. We can see that those 200 records will be inserted into the fact table. We're happy with that. what we want it to be. We're going to repeat the same step that we did before in order to get these into a tool container for both documentation and for control purposes, because we have one more piece of this workflow to build. This is the puppy fact table. We highlight the pieces that are indeed the puppy fact table, which are these pieces here. We drag them into and place this container, and now we'll want to disable it. We are now ready to build the final piece of this workflow, which is getting a transaction log records written for each of the fields coming in from this file so that we can report on its consistency, how many records, and other information associated with the feed so that we can assure that we are getting good data on day after day. To do this, we're bringing in a few other pieces of workflows. One of the nice things associated with containers is that I can actually copy and paste an entire container in from another workflow as opposed to copying in individual widgets. So we walk through this very quickly. What I want to do is to bring in the records from our workflow and put them into a data profiling widget. This will allow us to go ahead and see specific attributes associated with this very briefly so that we can run a test through here. When we run this, ignoring the errors of this join at the end, what we see is that the data profile returns us multiple records for each of the fields where it's producing some of the metadata associated with this attribute. We don't want all of this metadata, we just want some of the metadata, and that is where this list comes in. It puts in here the specific metadata names that we want to keep. It also includes the name of the data file that we're feeding in because that's part of our log record. Once that comes in, you see that now we have a reduced set of records, but what we want to do is to go ahead and create one record for each field coming in, and we can do that with the crosstab widget. As you can see by its picture, the crosstabs widget is designed to take records and turn them into columns, and we do that by grouping the data. So essentially we group the data by the input file name and its attribute name. We create a specific column for each of the records identified by the name field, and we give it a value of value. This is an aggregated step, so we must determine how to deal with multiple records should they occur. We don't have multiple records, but we still need to tell Alteryx how to deal with them if they were there. We choose first, which will just give us the first value coming in. Don't forget, we still need this transaction date being applied here, so let's go ahead and drag that down into our Append Fields. And dragging in a browse so we can see what that result looks like before we insert it into the data. We run just this piece of it. We can see that we now have a very nice record. It has the input file name, each of the attributes found in that file, the data type, the longest length, and other metadata associated with it, as well as the time, so we can do some nice reporting. So we want to go ahead and output that into our database. And we bring in the widget that I've already used so that this data will be put into the transaction log table. It will be appended. And we'll now have a record of how this ran. And we can see very quickly that data was now inserted into the log table. So we're happy with this being run. Now we have one other minor problem that might crop up. And depending upon the constraints that you've developed in your database, it's always a good idea to populate your puppy dimension first before populating the puppy fact table. So let's go ahead and deal with how to sequence two separate pieces of your workflow. So let's disable the puppy fact table, undisable it actually, so we can see what it looks like. We're going to do the same thing with the puppy dimension. So the question becomes, how do we stage each individual piece of this? So when we're running it in production, the dimension table is populated first, and then the fact table is populated second. There is a widget that we can deal with to solve this problem. It's found over here in the developer category. There is a block until done. This allows you to sequence your process. To accomplish this, we're simply going to delete this connection for now. And we're going to drop this block until done just before the puppy dimension. And you can see that our data flows into the stop until done, and then it flows out into the puppy dimension. It'll be the second process. We could reconnect it as one. Alteryx likes to connect this in the middle when you start, so it's okay. Since nothing is at 1, 2 will run first. Connect 3 down here. What this should do then is to stage our processing so that we run the puppy dimension part of the workflow first, and then the puppy fact table workflow when that has been completed. So we had a brief pause in there while we waited for my data to be cleaned up so we can run this without getting any errors. So I reran my initial population. So the data was reset back to where we were ready for our first transaction file. Keep in mind that in this workflow, if we did run this against the same set of data twice, our primary keys that we defined within the database would cause the records to error out. But I just want to get a clean sequential running of this. The data reset has completed. I can now run this. And you can see that rather than starting all these processes in a random order, it is going to go ahead and complete the puppy dimension population first. Once that is completed, it'll go through and do the puppy fact table second. You may notice that the transaction log has already been processed. We're not really concerned as to what order that was written, so we just allowed it to flow normally. Our bigger concern was making sure the dimension went first and the fact went second. As you can see, this has been completed in that order, so we have a successful workflow that we can continue to apply transactions from our puppy application into our puppy data mart. If you have any questions, please subscribe. Enter in your comments any questions you might have, and I can do subsequent videos to address your questions. Thank you.